Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the annual forum. I know it's been a very exciting, very interesting lineup of speakers throughout the day, so delighted to join you here this afternoon. My name is Suzanne Lynch. I'm a journalist with Politico based in Brussels, from where I'm coming to you now. And I'm delighted to chair this final session with Kelly Beaver, CEO of Ipsos UK and Ireland. Kelly, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to hear from Kelly for her presentation on the most recent analysis, Ipsos analysis on these Brexit issues that was out this morning. Can I please encourage anyone for questions? You know how to do it, and enter those questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get round to those at the end. So thank you very much again for your time, and over to you, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for that warm introduction. And hello, everybody. It's great to be back with you again today. It's since, I think, a similar time last year. So I want to use this presentation to share some new data that we have out today. You may have seen it in Politico and other places, which just allows us to reflect a little bit on what the public are thinking are the likely flashpoints for the relationship between the UK and the EU over the next few years. Given my title and the role and responsibility I have, it's possibly not a surprise that I will focus in the first half of my presentation on the views of the British public. But then I hope this gives a bit of a new layer to the discussions you've had taking place today. Towards the latter part, I'm going to reflect a little bit more on how the values of EU and UK citizens compare on some of the really important areas of public interest, such as climate change, which of course is a problem in the here and now and very much into the future too. So just to start, reaffirming what we have seen elsewhere, the British public are agreed, 8 in 10, that it's really important for Britain to maintain a close relationship with the EU. We've polled on this question every year, actually, since Britain's referendum around leaving or staying in the EU, and the result is surprisingly unvaried. This includes Leave voters too, so you see there 7 in 10 of Leave voters. And actually, what's interesting is few want to cut Europe off in exchange for a more global Britain. They want their cake and they want to eat it too. And Europe does maintain its preeminent position as Britain's most important relationship. Over 4 in 10, you can see here at the top of this chart, saying that it's more important than either the US or the Commonwealth. And this is different. It's a swing away from what we recorded in March 2021. Things have been back reversed, and we're back now in the longer term picture with that 4 in 10 saying Europe's the most important relationship. And just reflect back a little bit on what is unique about March 2021. And of course, we had the vaccine rollout in the UK, which did actually cause some of the numbers to be different, not just for this slide, but for some others as well, because people were feeling very positive about the UK response by comparative to their European counterparts. So again, though interesting for this one, amongst Leave voters, Europe still comes out top, though it is much closer to the scores on the Commonwealth. So 33% of Leave voters saying Europe is the most important relationship, 29% of Leave voters saying Commonwealth, with 1 in 5 stating the US. And just an important caveat to the finding here is that the public are evenly split, though, on whether the UK and the EU are likely to have a close relationship in future. 45% say it's likely, 45% say it's unlikely. And Leave voters are actually more optimistic on the measure. So over half think that it's likely compared to their Remain counterparts. So that again, feeling more optimistic as if things will be relatively fine. And we've asked this question before as well, improving trade. It is the top priority that Britons have when it comes to the relationship with the EU, which repeats the trend from the last time we asked it, which was before the trade and cooperation agreements were signed. And after trade, what do we see just tucked in under there? It is about security, reducing illegal immigration and responding to Russian invasion of Ukraine, top priorities for the relationship, followed closely by preventing and detecting crime and terrorism. But look down the bottom. Look down the bottom of the list and you will see some surprising candidates. For instance, worth bearing in mind is a poll of Great Britain, and so Northern Ireland is not included in this poll. So it's not the whole of the UK, but 1 in 10 say that working with the EU to ensure political and economic stability in Northern Ireland is a priority from the EU-UK relationship. And that's a potentially worrying finding because it suggests the issue may be one where for England, Wales, Scotland, it's felt that there's more space for confrontation, actually. We also asked about whether the public felt that the EU and UK were aligned in terms of their interests. And you can see here that the public think that there are frictions. A quarter, so looking down the bottom there, completely believe that the UK and the EU have mostly or completely the same interests. And 1 in 5, the red at the top, say the absolute opposite. We're completely and mostly at odds. Now, the highest proportion is in this middle part, which say 2 and 5, that they're partly the same, partly at odds. And what's striking for the responses we got to this question is that actually this very similar perceptions exist between those who are considered Leave versus Remain supporters. Remain supporters slightly more likely to think that our interests between the EU and the UK are completely and mostly the same, but there are not big differences here across the piece. And further to this, half the public are not confident that the UK and EU will work together to achieve a good outcome on the issues that matter most to them. You can see this as nearly half here, the red part of this graph. And Leave voters, again, more confident. You've got 47% saying so compared to with only 38% of Remain voters. So again, more confident that things will be okay and that the relationship between the UK and EU will be able to work together to achieve the outcomes that are their top priorities. And what about the public views then on really specific policy areas where the EU and the UK might be closer or might be further apart? And despite some of the news stories about unilateral action and lawsuits on Northern Ireland Protocol, the British public actually see the two sides as furthest apart on handling illegal immigration across the Channel. Those two issues, though, so the Northern Ireland Protocol and illegal immigration, they are the ones where the public perceive the least alignment. By contrast, looking up to the top of this chart, they do think that there are greater perceptions of actually consensus on issues like fighting crime and terrorism, dealing with Russia, and reducing carbon emissions. So despite the negative headlines, it is clear the British public see ample room for cooperation on mutual long-term interests. Which takes me to the second part of the presentation, where I want to zoom in a little and just think about how the UK fits with the broader picture of values. And values are slower to change over time. They are the underlying belief systems that we have. And you might expect from the previous slide, we do see close alignment actually here between the UK and EU citizens in particular countries on a range of really big picture issues. So let's just have a look at a few. For instance, in the past, we asked people about their ideal type of society, and they can choose between a more socialist, social democratic ideal, where society emphasizes social and collective provision of welfare, and a more hard-nosed competitive world where people are really encouraged to look after themselves. So, of course, looking at this, you can see the US and America at one extreme end of the scale, and countries at the other end of the scale, like Italy and Spain, with more socialist ideal. Britain is somewhere in the middle, equidistant actually between France and America, and ranks similar to Poland and Germany. We've also seen this long-term evolution of values on the topic of climate change in the UK. So at the start, and Britain moved much closer now to some of its European counterparts. At the start of the last decade, it was far more in the America space. So with arguments in the UK over whether climate change is real, taking centre space. But look at the chart, and this is the last decade we've plotted. Over the intervening years, what we've seen is this consensus forming now where the majority, significant majority of people in Britain believe that we're heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. So that consensus is formed. And it's moved now much more in line with their European mainstream. For example, you can see France and Germany just plotted on this chart. This was a study across 11 countries. And so when we see Britons in our new poll looking at net zero now, it's one of the areas, as you see from the data we published today, as an area for cooperation. That's a relatively new phenomena, but one that's supported by a powerful shift in the underlying value system of citizens in the country. And then finally, from our polling for World Refugee Day, which was released just last month, Britain's actually very similar to many other European countries, including Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, on whether people should be able to take refuge in other countries. Around 8 in 10 believe people should be able to take refuge in other countries, including in this country, to escape from war or persecution. And in fact, Britons are amongst the most likely, just at the top of the chart here, number 3, to say that they think their government should take more refugees than it does at present. So whilst illegal immigration is a potential flashpoint in the public's imagination, when it does come to looking after those in greatest need, British values are actually very different. And as you saw from the previous chart, more in alignment with their European neighbours. So to summarise, Britain citizens, they do see Europe and the EU still as the most important relationship, and that's true for both Leavers and Remain. Minorities think that both the EU and UK interests are always aligned, and again, we see Leave and Remain with quite similar views on that. And then lastly, there's great agreement on those big picture values, and you can see that coming through in ones that really matter, like climate change for the future. And the question is really, how can the alignment in some areas that are really important for the collective citizens of other nations across the EU and the UK be used to help strengthen cooperation in some of those areas where we're seeing flashpoints? And I'd love to see whether there are any views from the audience on how that can be leveraged. On that positive note, I will leave it there.
Thanks a million, Kelly. That was a really interesting presentation, and I suppose kind of food for thought when it comes to more positive analysis of the relationship between the UK and the EU, where you have explored there some of the landing zones of shared values and that kind of thing. One of the top lines kind of towards the beginning, and I'm looking at some of the material that was published this morning, is the fact that the polling shows that the proportion of Britons who think that Brexit has made their daily life worse has risen from 3 in 10 in June last year to 45% now. And I was interested to see that the proportion of Leave voters who say this has also increased. It's lower. It's at 22%, so much lower than the 45% generally, but it's still at 22%, which is doubled from the last time. I mean, what's your view on that? Is this is a worry, I suppose, that some people think that Brexit is worse than they thought. And is that just a condition of the fact that we've got some of those issues that still have not been resolved? For example, Northern Ireland Protocol, but also other parts of the relationship. For example, the Horizon 2020 research programme. We still don't know if they're going to be able to work out that one. So how do you account for that increase in concern, if you like, among Britons about the impact of Brexit on their daily lives?
So what we're also seeing in that poll, Suzanne, is that there are more people who have actually made up their mind and went to either side of the it's getting better or it's getting worse. There are quite a large proportion the last time we polled this who hadn't really made up their mind yet, and they were in that don't know camp. And some of the qualitative work that we've seen done in this particular question, because there are lots of people researching what the public think of Brexit, whether it's a good or bad thing, how they would vote today, etc. And what we're seeing are some really dominant themes coming through around cost of living and the association with what's causing some of the cost of living rises. And also the labour market is very, very tight at the minute. And again, people reflecting a little bit on some of those labour market challenges. There's not necessarily, and I know there are lots of different literature pieces out now, the categorical link, just cost of living is just driven by Brexit, because it isn't. There are lots of other things there. But I think the British public now they're reflecting more on some of the things they're seeing in their daily lives. And also worth noting, there's just broadly a trend that people now think the country is going, over 2/3 think the country's going in the wrong direction rather than the right one. So there's a general public mood sentiment, and then why is the public mood like this, and how do people feel about Brexit? But I would put it in the broader context, which is it's quite a somber public mood. The UK is not on its own there.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is not necessarily in your own research, but I suppose there's a debate at the moment about how the media cover the issue of cost of living issues and how far Brexit is to blame or not. And, you see the BBC, for example, getting criticised from all sides, from both sides, about what's to blame, for this cost of living crisis and different economic challenges in the UK. And as you say there, well, it's difficult to separate these strands. It's difficult to quantify. Although I do have to say, I mean, it was interesting, those economic figures out recently that showed that Britain its growth is expected to be the lowest of the G7. And I suppose one distinction is Brexit has happened between Britain and the EU, whereas every other country is dealing with those cost of living issues and inflationary issues too. So it's very interesting kind of philosophical point at the moment.
Well, the public are really, really watching the cost of living news stories. We also track what they're watching by way of stories. So top answer, cost of living. Beneath the surface of that, you did have things like Ukraine, and last week the rail strikes were obviously a dominant part of it. But the amount of disruption that we're going to see over the coming months, which are a bit of the strain linked to cost of living, but also the labour market itself, where workers do have a bit more power at the minute in the labour market just because of the shortages, and that level of disruption and the association, not just from the press, but how much is that, as you say, is trickling down to the general public. The summer of discontent, which is now a well-known phrase that is heading our way, I think that will also be feeding into people's perceptions of how Brexit has transformed their daily lives too. And international travel and the European travel is also going to be getting a lot more challenging.
Yeah, interesting. And one of the themes there that came up was about trade, and that it was interesting that tops the list of public priorities for Britain's relationship with the EU, which I kind of thought was interesting as well. I mean, we know during the campaign there was a lot about immigration, a lot about the right to make your own laws and the role of the ECJ, but trade seems to be the one that's topping the list there.
Yeah, it is. And I think, so just on a point of immigration, so again, we track what worries the general public. And between 2015 and today, we've seen an absolute collapse in the levels of concern about immigration in the country. So it has really dropped down. And a couple of underlying reasons for that. One of them, of course, is people have a perception that things are more under control, even if actually immigration has went up, but the public perception is that it is more under control. But then also there are other issues that have come to the fore, which the public are more worried about. And the economy, interestingly, is higher. And this links in obviously to trade, which is your point about how that is still tracking so high. Inflation, the economy, and the growth of the economy are definitely on the public's minds. There's a very negative economic outlook. Economic pessimism is really high at the minute. 7 in 10 people think things are going to get worse. The economy is going to get worse over the next 12 months.
Very interesting. So it's part of that broader public concern about the economy and trade. So again, it's kind of interesting how the public's perceptions can change about what's important in terms of Brexit, reflecting on the historical point they're in and what's happening around them. And sometimes it's hard to disentangle cause and effect. On the point you made, it'd be great if you could come back to it a bit about, I was interested about the concern for the Northern Ireland Protocol and the fact that in GB, I think it was the 10% figure. Maybe you just expand a bit on that and how you think that is playing as an issue, because it's still the dominant unresolved issue of the Brexit agreement.
It is. I think you have to look at the context of how people, if you ask the average citizen of Great Britain whether it really matters to them whether Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, actually people in Northern Ireland feel more strongly about that than people within the rest of Britain. And I think it's something like 2 in 5 people across the UK believe that Northern Ireland will not be part of the United Kingdom in 5 years' time. I don't think that's the case personally, but I'm not allowed to have a personal opinion. But obviously, the public, there's a sentiment that things are drifting a little bit there. And this statistic didn't really surprise me, the 1 in 10 figure, because it just plays into the level of importance that the general public in GB place on Northern Ireland being part of the wider UK. Northern Ireland, obviously, this is an incredibly hot topic. I'm sure it dominates. I'm no longer living there, so I don't see the news channels and the volume to which this is dominating. But we know from some of the polls that high proportions want to see a sort of collaborative agreement reached rather than a unilateral decision taken. And we see that coming through in the polling sentiment.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And perhaps, I mean, it's so linked to the trade discussion as well, the Northern Ireland Protocol, like the actual physical images of the trucks coming through and the different channels. And it's really kind of crystallized these theoretical concepts of trade for people. So perhaps, even similarly, it could feed into that concern about trade. And we've some questions coming in here. Just the first one here. Yeah, this is interesting. I think it's picking up on this, which I'm very interested in, the distinction between the general public opinion and the Leave voters' public opinion. Is there a sense, this is from Bill Roger Treasure, is there a sense in which Leave voters being more optimistic that it'll be all right in the end reflects the same approach of the 2016 vote? So in other words, that kind of optimism, because they do seem to be quite optimistic in this kind of, in these studies.
So there are definitely underlying perceptions that are about the we did Bill, we did this question last time, which just showed you how stark the underlying perceptions are. And actually, your identity as Leave and Remain is still one of it's becoming more prevalent and dominant than your Conservative Labour voter identity. We did a question last time asking for what people thought were the benefits and what people thought were the negative things that were likely to happen as a result of the UK exiting the EU. And top answer for Leave voters, where there were no negatives, and the top answer for Remain voters were there were no positives from this happening. And actually, that still underlies some of the data. You see it coming through today, the stuff I presented, where yes, Leave voters are more optimistic than the Remain voters about some of those key questions, like whether or not your outcomes will be successful, the positive outcomes you want to achieve will be successfully negotiated, and whether this relationship between the UK and the EU will be a so fruitful one in future. So you definitely see some of those underlying perceptions still holding.
Interesting. Another question that's linked from Polo Giver here. Is there any indication in the surveys that the UK or Northern Ireland population is now any better informed or has a better understanding of what the EU is about and how it actually works?
It's a really good question, because my understanding now is many of the EU surveys no longer include Northern Ireland, or no longer include the UK. So all the big studies that would be done pan-EU, like Flash, etc., all of those, the UK is no longer one of the countries that's covered, I think. So you wouldn't have, and that would be normally where you would be seeing questions asked about people's understanding of the EU, etc. I haven't seen any done in the UK myself on that, but I'm not adverse to putting in a question and getting some kind of response. So if there's a good EU-wide question that could be replicated in the UK, it might be a really interesting one. My sense is probably not a huge shift, but you should never guess. You should always ask.
Interesting. Another question coming in here. Yeah, interesting. This is from Ivana. Did you differentiate between Leave voters who would still vote Leave and those who had in between changed their minds, and ditto for Remain voters?
No, I haven't, and you'll have seen that split wasn't presented in the data. And I think when you start doing that, you get into quite small numbers, especially when the questions themselves have many response options. But the underlying data will all be available on our website anyways, as we're part of the British Polling Council, so everything we do is transparent and available. So you could potentially, if you would like to.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because I think it's kind of a theme here. It's so interesting seeing the Leave voters, very do we all see what we want to believe, in a sense? I suppose it's kind of the sense that their perception is more positive.
Yes.
And maybe a lot of people would have expected. I'm presuming that's what most people are feeling here. Almost coming to an end now, but another question from Mark English. Would it be right to say that these results indicate there is limited public support for the continuing culture war confrontation with the EU? That's no longer a successful wedge issue for the Conservatives. Maybe even the culture war bit is interesting. I mean, is this an issue anymore for people?
So we've done quite a big study on culture wars, actually, alongside King's College in London. And if you're interested in this as a topic, it's definitely worth a read. I think the media are more interested in the culture war narrative than the general public, though some of the topics, some of the terms that are used to instigate a culture war are very much becoming more well known amongst the public. So I think, is there questions about?
Do you mean that, like, when you're saying the words are used, what kind of word? I
Well,
mean,
a lot of the culture war rhetoric uses battle terminology, so it tends to use quite warlike phrases and
poised for showdown or something.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, and then also things terms like woke, and you see a lot of that terminology used as well to demonize or create some scenario, make it a them and an us scenario effectively. And there is definitely, I think, one of the what the culture wars narratives are more resonant in the media than the public. I think we do still see the strong identity split between the them and the us, between the leave and the remain. Though some of the areas where there is commonality that come through in this data set did give some really positive hope. So in particular, that climate change agenda and how the UK public have really moved their mindsets. So I think there are areas where you can really get away from that culture war battle zone, them and us, that can lead to positive collaboration in future.
Well, look, I think that's a very positive note to finish on. You're absolutely right that what's actually worrying people in Britain about Brexit may be different than what we might think, and that the fact that the survey shows there is a lot of common ground there, away from the politics and the perception. So thanks so much, Kelly. That was fascinating discussion, and as you said there, I think you directed people there for who want to look into this in more detail. I will certainly be keeping my eye on how this tracks. It's very, very interesting to watch that development and how it can change over time, reflecting what's happening in the world around us. So thank you very much again. And thank you to our audience for your involvement in this session and, of course, throughout the day. With that, I'm going to turn back to founder and director Paul Adamson for some closing remarks. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you, Kelly, for that wonderful presentation. My job is very simple now, is to give some very brief thanks to everybody for taking part in today. So first of all, thank all of you for watching. If you've been there since the very beginning, I do appreciate and admire your staying power and tenacity. Thank you all also for your questions, because without the questions, it would have been a rather maybe one-sided discussion. So it shows that you were paying attention and engaged. I'd like to thank the speakers for agreeing to take part and for doing so promptly, making my job rather easy. I'd like to thank again our sponsors, City of London, IBM, MSD and Vodafone for their support. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my colleagues who've done much of the huge behind the scenes work to make this conference a success. Brona Diamond, Rebecca Mattison and Joanna Lima. Thank you all very much. Finally, a word from me about the forum itself. We're almost 2 years old now, and it's been conceived as a kind of platform, as something to be shared and to partner with. We are increasingly partnering with all sorts of organizations, public authorities, think tanks, universities, associations, and civil society groups. So if you want to work with us in any shape or form, just drop me a line and I'll be very happy to have a conversation with you. Hopefully next time we can meet in person, or at least in hybrid form. Our program calendar of monthly webinars will pick up again in September after the holidays, and we'll be having more and more invitation-only roundtable discussions and other similar events as we go ahead in the next few months. So again, thank you again for being with us today, and see you next time. Bye-bye.